On May 3, 1948, the United States Supreme Court ruled unanimously in favor of a case brought before them titled Shelley versus Kraemer. This landmark decision would change America forever. And the roots of this case were planted and grew right here in St. Louis, Missouri. The story of Shelley versus Kraemer began before World War II when J.D. and Ethel Shelley moved from Starkville, Mississippi to St. Louis, where Mr. Shelley secured work at the Small Arms Defense Plant. There, he and his co-workers produced munitions to help with the war effort. Mr. Shelley's family was quite large, 9 in total, but the only housing they could find was downtown on 9th Street, a run-down 3-room apartment without regular heat in the winter months and without indoor plumbing. They were crowded, but they made do, as many Americans did during the war. Proud of his work in support of our fighting forces, Mr. Shelley never missed a day of work. After the war, Mr. Shelley used the skills he had learned in the defense plant to start a long career as a construction worker, helping with such projects as the State Bank of Wellston and renovations of Peevely Dairy and the arena. He earned a good salary and had the means to purchase a home for his family. Like many workers who had come north, he wanted to stay in the area and began looking for a more suitable place for his family to live. However, a huge obstacle stood in his way. At the time, in St. Louis, as well as in many other cities, African Americans could purchase their own homes in very few areas. Restrictive real estate covenants dictated where people could, and could not, own property based on race, color, creed, and national origin, making it virtually impossible for Mr. Shelley to purchase a home. One of the few places in St. Louis where African Americans could purchase homes was known as the Ville, and this is where the Shelleys wanted to live. The Ville fell within the boundaries created by these streets: Taylor Avenue on the west, St. Louis Avenue at north, Sarah Street on the east, and Easton Avenue to the south, today Martin Luther King Drive. It was a self-contained community with its own hospital, Homer G. Phillips Hospital, and school system, which included Charles Sumner High School, the first high school built west of the Mississippi River for African Americans. An island in a sea of segregation practices of the time, the Ville was a place where African American families could settle down and become part of the community. Finding there were no homes for sale in the Ville, the Shelleys were placed on a long waiting list of those wanting to move into the neighborhood. Frustrated, Mr. Shelley vowed he would find appropriate housing for his family. His resolve grew even more intense when one of his daughters was attacked in a run-down part of the city on her way home from school. It was time to move. At this point, Mr. James T. Bush, a prominent African-American realtor in St. Louis, learned of the Shelleys' plight and spearheaded a plan to help them find a home. He found a property for sale at 4600 Labadie Avenue, just outside the boundaries of the Ville. However, a restrictive covenant on the deed to the home declared, in part,
future sales will not be made to persons not of the Caucasian race for a period of 50 years from the date of undersignment of title.
Mr. Bush knew there would be legal consequences for breaking the covenant if he attempted to purchase the home for Mr. Shelley, but he came up with a plan. He enlisted the aid of 4 other individuals who were willing, without regard for their own personal safety and welfare, to risk everything to help the Shelley family, and, at the same time, to make a statement about how unjust the real estate covenants were. Mr. Bush called what he was doing a conspiracy of heroes. The other members of this group were Olivia Merriweather Perkins, a popular and highly respected teacher at Charles Sumner High School; Mrs. Josephine Fitzgerald, a Caucasian woman who had been married to a man from Cuba who had been beaten and killed a few years before because of his national origin; Reverend Robert Danielson, minister of one of the larger churches of the area; Mr. J.D. Shelley. These five then embarked upon a plan that required creative planning and secrecy of the highest order to succeed. Since he could not directly involve Mr. Shelley in the initial steps in the purchase of the property because of the restrictive covenant, Mr. Bush asked Mrs. Fitzgerald to serve as a straw buyer. A straw buyer purchases a property and then transfers the deed and title to another. This way, the true buyer of a property often isn't immediately known. In this case, the true buyer would be J.D. Shelley.
My Aunt Olivia and the others knew they all faced potentially serious consequences if they were caught. They could have been fined, they could have gone to jail, or far worse. But they still decided to move forward with the plan. Their belief in what they were doing was that strong.
At first, the plan unfolded perfectly. Mr. Bush helped Mrs. Fitzgerald purchase the property and then, through a carefully designed plan, was able to have the title, without initial notice, transferred to Mr. Shelley. Once the paperwork was completed, the Shelley family moved into their dream home. Mr. Shelley's daughter, Chat Lee, recalled the first night in the new home.
We thought we had all died and gone to heaven. It was the most beautiful home we had ever been in, and it was ours. That first night, we all thanked the Lord for our blessings. I remember this. I was a little girl, but I remember it all.
A couple living farther down Labadie, Louis and Fern Kraemer, saw the Shelleys moving in and at first thought they were renting the property. Later, when learning the Shelleys had purchased the home, the Kraemers enlisted the aid of the Marcus Avenue Improvement Association, a group of neighbors and realtors who believed they could legally force the Shelleys from their new home because of the covenant attached to the deed. Once the purchase had been reported to the authorities, Mr. Shelley, on his way home from work one day, was brought in and detained by St. Louis City Police. Soon vandals began regularly damaging the Shelley's yard and home and making threats to Mr. Shelley and the other members of his family. The ongoing abuse culminated when the Kraemers and their supporters filed suit in St. Louis Circuit Court to have the Shelleys' purchase of the home declared illegal and to have them evicted. Mr. Bush and Mr. Shelley then hired the best attorney they knew to represent them, George Vaughn. After a heated courtroom battle, St. Louis Circuit Court Judge William K. Kraemer ruled against the Kraemers and for Mr. Shelley. In his ruling, Judge Kraemer did not say that restrictive covenants were illegal. Instead, he said that this particular covenant could not be enforced because when it had been created on February 16, 1911, all homeowners in the neighborhood would have had to sign the document, but only 30 of the 39 homeowners in the neighborhood had done so, making the covenant incomplete. In essence, the judge, known to be a strong supporter of rights for all, chose to use a technicality to resolve the case. The Shelleys were overjoyed, but their jubilation would not last long. The Kraemers immediately appealed the decision to the Missouri Supreme Court, which overturned the initial ruling. For a time, it looked like the Shelley family would lose their home. Margaret Bush Wilson, James Bush's daughter, remembered the morning her father found out about the Missouri Supreme Court decision.
As long as I live, I will always remember that morning around our breakfast table. My father looked discouraged, and I can remember my mother's insistent words to him, "Oh, Dad, you can't give up now." Whereupon he arose from the table, went to the telephone, and summoned all the black real estate brokers to a meeting in our home that evening. It was at that meeting the decision was made to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court.
Once again, Mr. Bush and the others asked George Vaughn to pick up the fight, and he prepared the appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. On May 3, 1948, in a landmark decision, the Supreme Court voted to overturn the Missouri ruling by declaring,
racially restrictive covenants cannot be enforced by courts since this would constitute state action denying due process of law in violation of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which guarantees equal protection of the laws, which includes rights to acquire, enjoy, own, and dispose of property.
This ruling ended the legal effectiveness of restrictive real estate covenants. Mr. Vaughn's first words to reporters after the ruling was announced expressed his joy and optimism for the future.
The Supreme Court action will do much to fortify America's position before the world as a leading democratic nation and show the sincerity of its adherence to principles of equality for all people.
Finally, the Shelleys legally owned their own home and planted their roots, as did people all across the country, as restrictive covenants were declared unenforceable. Today, the Shelley versus Kraemer decision is hailed as one of the most important legal battles in U.S. history, a battle that helped lay the foundation for other rulings such as Brown versus Board of Education and other challenges as the civil rights movement gathered support. In recognition of the importance of the ruling, the Shelley home was designated as a National Historic Landmark on December 14, 1990. The Shelleys and Mr. Bush's conspiracy of heroes stood up for what they believed in, refused to tolerate the injustice around them, and worked within the legal system to bring about positive change and create opportunities for future generations.
I feel like definitely they changed the world. As a matter of fact, when I explained to my friends about my great-grandparents, because they truly were my heroes. They really were. When I explained to them about the case, I always tell them, you can live anywhere in this country that you want to live because of my great-grandparents.